They used to laugh at me for being poor, but when I became successful, they suddenly called me family. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. When I met Daniel, he was charming, kind, and so full of dreams. He didn't care that I came from a small town or that I didn't have much. He said love was all we needed, and I believed him. After we got married, I thought I had finally found peace. But I was wrong. The first time I met his family, I could feel the cold air in the room. His mother, Patricia, looked at me from head to toe like I was something she wanted to wipe off her shoes. She smiled, but it wasn't real. "You must be Emma," she said. "Daniel told us you're hardworking." I knew what that meant. It was her polite way of saying poor. His sister, Claire, barely spoke to me. His father just nodded once and went back to his newspaper. At dinner, they asked me questions that weren't really questions. They were tests. "Where did you go to college? What does your family do?" I tried to answer with grace, but I could see the judgment in Patricia's eyes. When I told them I worked as a designer for a small local brand, she smiled and said, "That's cute." My hands shook under the table, but I kept smiling. After the wedding, things didn't get better. We lived in a small apartment Daniel and I paid for together, but his mother made sure to remind him that he could have done better. She'd say things like, "Daniel, your friends all married women who could bring something to the table." Every visit left me feeling smaller. Daniel changed too. At first, he defended me, but slowly he started agreeing with them. He'd tell me to let it go or try harder to please his family. I worked long hours to help with bills, cooked, cleaned, and did everything to be the good wife. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Patricia would still find a way to insult me, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence. Once, I overheard her telling Daniel, "She's not like us, she'll always be beneath you." He didn't argue. That silence broke something inside me. But I stayed. I stayed because I loved him, and because I thought things would get better. I told myself love was supposed to be hard, that if I just proved myself, they'd accept me. But as the days passed, I began to realize it wasn't about what I did or didn't do. To them, I would always be the girl who didn't belong. That was the moment something in me began to change. I didn't know it yet, but their cruelty was planting the seed of the woman I was about to become. Every dinner with Daniel's family felt like walking into a battlefield. No one shouted, but the tension was sharp enough to cut through the air. Patricia always found a new way to embarrass me. She'd look at my dress and say, "That's interesting," in a tone that made it clear she hated it. She'd talk loudly about expensive brands, then glance at me as if to remind me I couldn't afford them. Claire would giggle quietly, and Daniel would just sit there, pretending not to notice. I tried to keep my head down and stay polite. I'd help serve food, clean up, and thank Patricia for dinner, but no matter how respectful I was, she found something wrong. "You hold your fork strangely," she'd say. "Didn't they teach table manners where you grew up?" Everyone would laugh softly, except me. I smiled on the outside, but inside I was breaking a little more each time. When Daniel lost his job, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe they'd finally see I was the one keeping things together. I started working 2 jobs, one at a small design studio during the day and another at a diner at night. I barely slept, but I didn't complain. I believed we were a team. I thought love meant standing by each other when life got hard. But to his family, it was my fault he'd fallen. Patricia told him, "She's bad luck, Daniel. You never had problems before you married her." When I overheard that, my chest tightened. Instead of defending me, Daniel said nothing. He just looked at the ground and let his mother's words hang in the air. That silence hurt more than anything. It was like he agreed. I'd come home after long shifts, exhausted, only to find him sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I'd ask how the job search was going, and he'd snap, "You think it's easy? You think you're better because you're working." I never said that. I was just trying to keep us afloat. At dinner with his family, Patricia acted like I wasn't even there. When I tried to join the conversation, she'd talk over me or change the topic. Once, when I mentioned I got a promotion, she laughed and said, "Oh, that's sweet, dear. Daniel will be back on his feet soon. You won't have to stress yourself." It was her way of saying my efforts didn't matter. Daniel's father avoided eye contact. His sister whispered behind her napkin. I sat there, eating quietly, swallowing more than just food. I swallowed my pride, my anger, and my pain. I wanted to scream, to ask Daniel why he let them treat me that way, but I stayed silent, because every time I spoke, it only made things worse. I started realizing something. I was living in a house full of people, but I had never felt more alone. The man I thought would protect me had become a stranger sitting across the table, and his silence had become the loudest sound in my world. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would change everything. I hoped a baby would bring some light into the darkness that had taken over our marriage. I imagined Daniel smiling again, his family finally softening toward me. I thought maybe, just maybe, they would see me differently, not as the poor girl who married their son, but as the mother of their grandchild. For a few days, I allowed myself to believe things could get better. When I told Daniel, he seemed happy at first. He hugged me, kissed my forehead, and said, "This is what we needed." For the first time in a long while, I saw hope in his eyes. But that feeling didn't last. As soon as he told his mother, the warmth disappeared. Patricia didn't even try to hide her disgust. She looked at me and said, "Let's hope the child doesn't inherit her poverty." The room went silent. My heart dropped, and I felt like someone had punched the air out of me. Daniel didn't say a word. He just stood there, his head down, pretending he didn't hear it. That night, I couldn't stop crying. I lay on the bed, my hand over my stomach, whispering promises to the tiny life inside me. I promised to protect it, to give it love, even if no one else did. Daniel sat beside me, scrolling through his phone, not even looking up. When I finally asked him, "Why didn't you defend me?" he sighed and said, "You're too sensitive, Emma." My mom didn't mean it like that. His words stung more than Patricia's insult. He didn't see how much it hurt me, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. As my belly grew, so did the distance between us. I went to doctor's appointments alone because Daniel was too busy. When I came home tired and emotional, he said I was being dramatic. Every time I tried to talk about the baby, he changed the subject. I began to realize that the man I married only felt strong when I was small, when I stayed quiet, when I didn't argue, when I accepted the blame. Patricia still called often, pretending to care about Daniel's stress, but never asking how I was. Once she even told him, "You need to make sure that baby grows up more like you than her." I heard it through the phone, and it broke me all over again. I stopped expecting kindness. At night, I'd sit by the window, rubbing my stomach, wondering what kind of world I was bringing my child into. I told myself I had to be stronger, not for Daniel, not for his family, but for the little life depending on me. By the time I reached the last months of my pregnancy, I knew something had changed in me. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was angry, and that anger started turning into something powerful. For the first time, I began to understand that maybe love wasn't enough if it meant losing yourself completely. When Daniel's company went bankrupt, it felt like the final crack in a glass that had been breaking for years. He had borrowed money, made risky deals, and ignored every warning sign. I tried to help him stay calm, telling him we'd figure it out together, but he wasn't listening anymore. His pride was louder than reason. When everything finally fell apart, his family wasted no time finding someone to blame. And, as always, that someone was me. Patricia said it first. "Ever since she came into your life, everything's gone wrong," she told him over dinner. "She's brought nothing but bad luck." I stood there, holding my plate, pretending not to hear, but the words burned through me. Daniel didn't defend me. He just rubbed his temples, sighed, and said, "Mom, please," like he was tired of both of us. That silence told me everything. A few days later, Patricia came to our apartment. She didn't even look around, just went straight to the point. "You need to start fresh, Daniel," she said. "Divorce her. You can't move forward with dead weight dragging you down." I was standing in the hallway, frozen, listening. She said it like I wasn't even a person, like I was a mistake to erase. Daniel didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He just sat there, quiet, letting her words fill the room. When she left, I asked him if that's really what he wanted. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "I don't know." That was the moment I knew everything between us was gone. Not because of his failure, but because of what it revealed, that I was only valuable to him when things were good. That night, I didn't argue or cry. I packed my bags quietly. I didn't have much, just a few clothes, my sketchbooks, and a small box of baby things I had kept even after losing the pregnancy months earlier. Daniel didn't stop me. He sat on the couch, staring at the floor, saying nothing. When I walked out the door, he didn't even look up. I didn't have a plan or a place to go. I ended up renting a small room from an old coworker. The first few nights were the hardest. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how I'd given everything to someone who never saw my worth. But in that loneliness, I also felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. For the first time, no one was talking down to me, no one was judging me, and no one was waiting for me to fail. I cried, yes, but not from weakness. Those tears felt like washing away the last pieces of a life that never really belonged to me. I didn't know how, but I promised myself I would rebuild, not to prove anything to Daniel or his family, but to prove something to myself. I was done being someone's shadow. It was time to become my own light. Starting over was harder than I imagined. I had nothing but my skills, a few clothes, and a tired heart. The small room I rented was barely enough to fit a bed and a desk, but it was mine, a place where I could breathe again. I started looking for work, applying everywhere I could. Most companies didn't even reply. A few interviews ended with polite smiles and empty promises. It was discouraging, but I refused to give up. Finally, I got a job at a small startup that designed digital products. It wasn't fancy and the pay was low, but I didn't care. It was a chance to start again. The office was tiny, and I shared a desk with another new hire, but I worked like it was the biggest opportunity of my life. I stayed late, learned new software, and took on every small task no one else wanted to do. Some days, I skipped meals just to afford the subway fare, but I told myself this was only temporary. The people there didn't know my past, and I liked it that way. I could just be Emma, not Daniel's wife, not Patricia's disappointment, not the poor girl who didn't belong. I was just someone trying to build something from nothing. There were nights I came home so tired that I couldn't even stand in the shower. I cried quietly, not out of sadness this time, but out of exhaustion and stubborn hope. A few years passed like that. I started getting noticed for my work, small compliments at first, then bigger responsibilities. I became the person others came to for help. I took risks, pitched ideas, and slowly climbed up. My designs started gaining attention, and I was invited to meetings I never thought I'd be part of. The girl who once sat silently at dinner tables now spoke confidently in front of investors. After 3 years, the company hit a rough patch and nearly went under. Most employees left, but I stayed. I believed in what we were building. I worked day and night, helping find new clients, rebranding the business, and pushing through when everyone else gave up. My loyalty caught the attention of one of the investors, a kind man named Robert, who saw potential in me. Together, we decided to start something new, our own design firm. Those first months were chaos. We had no office, no team, and barely any money. But I knew what it felt like to start from zero. I had done it before. I poured everything into it, every ounce of pain, rejection, and insult I'd ever faced. Each one became fuel. 5 years after walking out of Daniel's life, I stood in a glass office in New York City with my name on the wall. Emma Williams, co-founder, Alara Designs. Clients respected me. My team admired me. I wasn't rich just in money. I was rich in peace, strength, and pride. Everything they once used to shame me had become the reason I succeeded. The charity gala was one of those events I used to only see in magazines. Bright lights, elegant gowns, and people who spoke like every word mattered. I had been invited as one of the sponsors for the evening, representing my company, Alara Designs. I stood near the entrance, greeting people and smiling, feeling proud of how far I had come. I wasn't nervous this time. I had worked hard to earn my place in that room. The night was going well until I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. It was Patricia. I turned slowly, and there she was, dressed in her usual expensive style, holding a glass of champagne, laughing among a group of wealthy guests. For a moment, my heart skipped. It was strange, seeing the woman who once made me feel like I wasn't enough, standing there in the same world she once told me I didn't belong to. She didn't notice me at first. I watched her from across the room, calm and quiet. A few people came to greet me, including one of the event organizers who proudly introduced me to a group of donors. Everyone meet Emma Williams, CEO of Alara Designs. Her company's work has transformed the design space in New York. I smiled and shook hands as flashes from cameras went off. Patricia's laughter stopped mid-sentence. She turned toward us, confused, her eyes narrowing as she tried to place my face. I could see the exact moment it hit her. The woman standing in front of her, confident, graceful, and respected, was the same one she had called poor and unworthy. Her expression changed from confusion to disbelief, then to something close to shame. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The room did the talking for me. People were shaking my hand, complimenting my company, asking about collaborations. Patricia stood there frozen, clutching her drink like she needed it to stay upright. One of the guests beside her smiled and said, "Oh, Patricia, you must know Emma. She's doing amazing things in the design world." Her lips twitched. "Yes, I've met her before," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. I met her eyes and smiled politely. "It's been a long time," I said. She tried to respond, but her words got lost somewhere between pride and regret. For a moment, we just stood there, surrounded by everything she once said I could never have. As the night went on, I mingled with clients and other guests, while Patricia stayed on the sidelines, watching. I caught her glancing at me a few times, maybe trying to find the right moment to speak, but I never gave her one. I wasn't cruel. I was just done giving her space in my story. Before I left, she finally walked up and whispered, "You've done well for yourself." I nodded and said, "I always could. You just never saw it." Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the same silence she once used to make me feel small. This time, it was her turn to feel it. A few weeks after that gala, I got a message from a number I hadn't seen in years. It was Daniel. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, not sure what to feel. He wrote, "Hey Emma, I've been thinking about you. I'm sorry for everything. Can we talk?" I could almost hear his voice in those words, the same soft tone he used when he wanted something. At first, I ignored it. I had no reason to open old wounds. But he didn't stop. He called, left voicemails, even sent long texts saying he'd left his family, that he finally realized how wrong he'd been. He said he regretted letting me go and that he wanted to make things right. I didn't believe it. The timing was too perfect. Patricia had seen me at the gala, successful, respected, everything she once said I couldn't be. I knew she was behind this. It sounded exactly like something she'd do, not out of love for me, but to protect her family's image. After a few days of silence, I finally replied with one word. Okay. I agreed to meet him. Not because I missed him or wanted him back, but because I needed closure. There were still pieces of my past I hadn't fully faced, and Daniel was one of them. We decided to meet at a small cafe in the city. The moment I walked in, I saw him sitting by the window looking nervous. He stood up quickly when he saw me, smiling like nothing had happened. "Emma, wow, you look amazing," he said. I just nodded and sat down. There was an awkward pause, the kind that fills the space between two people who used to know everything about each other, but now feel like strangers. He started talking fast about how much he'd changed, how miserable he'd been after I left, how he'd finally realized his family was toxic. He said all the right things, but his eyes told another story. There was no real remorse there, just a hint of calculation, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. When he asked about my life, I told him the truth. I told him about my company, my work, my peace. He smiled, but I could tell it stung. For once, I had something he couldn't control. "I'm proud of you," he said, but it didn't sound sincere. It sounded like envy dressed up as admiration. Then came the question I knew was coming. "Maybe we could start over," he said quietly. "We were good together once, weren't we?" I looked at him. The man who had stood by while his family tore me apart, who had watched me walk away without a word. I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance. "We were never good, Daniel," I said softly. "I was good. You just didn't see it." He looked down, speechless. For the first time, I saw him small, not because I wanted revenge, but because I no longer needed his approval. I stood up, left some cash on the table, and walked away. That meeting wasn't about forgiveness or revenge. It was about freedom. And I finally had it. Daniel called again a few days after our first meeting. He said he wanted to take me to dinner, just to talk properly this time. I almost said no, but a part of me wanted to close that chapter once and for all. So I agreed. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, one of those places where everything felt too polished, too perfect. When I arrived, he was already there, smiling like he had been waiting for me all his life. He stood up and pulled out my chair, trying to be the man I once wished he had been. "You look beautiful, Emma," he said. I smiled politely. I had learned long ago that not every compliment came from a good place. We ordered dinner, and for the first few minutes, the conversation stayed light. He talked about work, how hard things had been since the bankruptcy, how he was finding himself again. I listened, quiet but calm. Then he shifted the topic to me. "I've seen articles about your company," he said, his tone a mix of pride and surprise. "I always knew you were special. Remember when I told you you'd make it one day?" I almost laughed. He was rewriting the past right in front of me, twisting old memories into something that made him look supportive instead of silent. I let him talk, though. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear how far he'd go. He spoke about our old apartment, our good times, and how he missed my cooking, my laugh, my kindness. He said things like, "I didn't appreciate you enough back then. And I've changed, Emma. I really have." Every word sounded practiced, like he'd been rehearsing. Maybe he thought nostalgia could make me forget everything that came with those memories. The tears, the loneliness, the way he used to look away when I needed him most. When our food arrived, he leaned forward and said softly, "I just want another chance. We could start over. I've realized you're the only person who ever really loved me." His voice cracked a little, like he wanted me to see his pain. For a moment, I looked at him, really looked at him. The same face, the same eyes, but I didn't feel what I used to. The woman sitting there wasn't the same girl who once begged for his affection. I wasn't broken anymore. I was stronger, calmer, and completely free. I put my fork down and smiled. "You taught me everything I needed to know," I said quietly. His eyes lit up for a second, thinking I was about to say something kind. Then I finished, about who not to be. The words hung between us. His smile faded. He didn't know what to say. I stood up, picked up my purse, and looked at him one last time. "Good luck, Daniel," I said softly. "You're going to need it." Then I walked out, not angry, not hurt, just done. That dinner wasn't a new beginning. It was the end I had been waiting for. About a week after that dinner with Daniel, I got a call I didn't expect. It was Patricia. Her voice sounded sweeter than I'd ever heard before. "Emma, dear," she said softly, "it's been such a long time. We're having a small family dinner this weekend. It would mean a lot if you could join us." For a moment, I was silent. Patricia had never called me dear in her life. I could tell right away there was something behind the invitation, but I accepted anyway. Not because I wanted to see them, but because I wanted to end things on my own terms. When I arrived at their house, everything felt strange, familiar but distant. The same walls that once made me feel so small now seemed smaller than ever. Patricia greeted me with open arms, smiling like we were long-lost friends. "You look wonderful, Emma," she said, her eyes scanning my dress and jewelry. Her husband and daughter joined in, acting overly polite, offering compliments that didn't sound real. The whole thing felt like a performance. Daniel was there too, looking uncomfortable. I noticed the tension in his jaw, the way he avoided eye contact. As we sat down at the table, I realized why I was really there. Patricia started talking about how the family had been going through some hard times, and how Daniel's new business idea was just a little short on funding. Her words were wrapped in fake warmth, but the message was clear. They needed my money. She spoke like she was doing me a favor, saying, "You've done so well for yourself, Emma. I'm sure you'd want to help Daniel get back on his feet." The others nodded along, pretending this was some kind of family reunion instead of what it really was, a setup. I listened quietly, letting them talk, watching them twist fake kindness into manipulation. I remembered every moment I had sat at that same table years ago, eating in silence while they mocked me. I remembered the humiliation, the tears I'd swallowed, the loneliness I'd felt surrounded by people who treated me like nothing. Now those same people were looking at me with forced smiles, hoping I would save them. After a while, Patricia raised her glass and said, "To family." Everyone followed, smiling awkwardly. That's when I stood up. I lifted my own glass and looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes. "You wanted me gone when I had nothing," I said calmly. "So now that I have everything, consider this my goodbye." The room went silent. No one moved. Patricia's smile froze. Daniel's eyes dropped to his plate. I placed my glass gently on the table, picked up my purse, and turned to leave. As I walked out of that house, I felt lighter than I ever had. It wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom, the kind that comes when you finally stop needing anyone's approval. I didn't look back. That chapter was closed, and for the first time in my life, I was completely free from them all. As Emma stepped out of that house for the last time, the night air felt different, calm, cool, and full of quiet power. For years, she had carried the weight of their cruelty, their words, their judgment. But now that weight was gone. Every step she took away from them felt lighter, like she was walking out of her past and into the life she had built with her own hands. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. The silence around her wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. When she reached her car, she paused for a moment and looked back at the house. The lights were still on, voices faintly arguing inside. But none of it mattered anymore. For the first time, Emma felt completely free. She had thought revenge would come from making them feel small the way they once made her feel. But standing there, she realized something deeper. Revenge was never about hurting others. It was about healing yourself until their opinions no longer mattered. As she drove through the quiet streets of the city, memories flashed before her. The nights she cried herself to sleep, the mornings she forced herself to get up and try again, the people who doubted her, and the rare few who believed in her. Every struggle, every scar, every sleepless night had brought her to this moment. She smiled softly, realizing she had turned her pain into power. When she reached home, she walked to the mirror in her living room. For years, that reflection had shown a woman who tried too hard to be accepted. But tonight, she saw someone different, someone strong, graceful, and finally enough for herself. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, and said, "They tried to erase me, but I rewrote my story." Her words hung in the air, gentle but firm. She thought about all the people who were still fighting battles like hers, the ones made to feel small for dreaming too big, or for coming from too little. If her story could teach them anything, it was this: you don't have to fight to be seen. You just have to rise until being unseen is no longer possible. Emma walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. She realized that success wasn't about money, fame, or proving a point. It was about peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop chasing approval and start living for yourself. That night, she sat down with a cup of tea, wrapped in the quiet warmth of her own company. She didn't feel lonely. She felt whole. The past no longer hurt, and the future no longer scared her. She had built a life from ashes and found something far more precious than wealth, her self-worth. For the first time in her life, Emma knew she didn't need anyone's acceptance to feel proud. She had already won, not by defeating them, but by becoming someone they could never break again.